Much of the First Testament, the Old Testament in the Bible, tells the story of God's dealings with the nation of Israel. And as we've discovered over the past couple Discover the Word podcasts, the book of Psalms in the Old Testament is a collection of poems that reflect a part of that story, beginning with the time known as the United Monarchy, the good days, when David and Solomon were the kings. But Israel really took a downward slide after Solomon left the throne. And so as the Discover the Word group continues our extended look at the Psalms, we're going to follow the historical trajectory of Israel into this crumbling era of their kingdom, this time of decline. What kind of Psalms tell the story of when everything was falling apart? Well, pull your chair up to the table as we continue to learn how to read the Psalms on Discover the Word. And welcome to the Discover the Word podcast, the small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries with Mart DeHaan, Elisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, and Daniel Orion Day. And this is part 4 of a 5-episode series of conversations called How to Read the Psalms. As we've said throughout the series, we really do love the Psalms. And for many of us, they are a go-to place in Scripture because of the way that we identify with the emotion and the feelings and the honesty we find there. And that's really going to be evident in the sections of Psalms we focus on this week. In difficult times, when things are falling apart or have fallen apart, and we can't see God's hand or His plan, we don't really feel His closeness, what do we do? Well, our focus in this episode will be on books 3 and 4, and how we see Israel's history reflected in what these Psalms are about. So let's dive right in with the group into another part of our study called How to Read the Psalms.
Describe a moment where things felt right, where your faith felt tangible, like you could reach out and touch God's promises or touch God's faithfulness. Does a moment come to mind for you, or some kind of season in your life?
Yeah, for me, it actually came out of a dark moment. I was in a ministry and we had hit a very difficult financial spot. It was in 2008. A lot of people were hitting tough spots like that. And I just remember crying out to God that He would meet our need. And out of the blue, a very generous, kind of unknown donor stepped forward and provided when I was concerned we couldn't even make payroll. And, came out of a dark season. So maybe that was the contrast that made it even more noticeable or tangible, but it was powerful. And I was like restored and deeply encouraged.
That's good. I'm going to go general on you, Daniel. You asked for specifics, but the specifics that come to mind are too personal to talk about. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to say my mind goes to any number of situations where all of a sudden, a very difficult, dark time, all of a sudden it was like, oh, good night. Look what the Lord has done through that probably never would have happened. And it's like in those moments, it's like, oh, this is being orchestrated. I couldn't really prove it to anybody else, but I know it is.
Yeah, that's good, Mart. Thank you.
For me, it's kind of like looking at all the pieces of a puzzle. If you don't look at the top of the box, you don't know how they're going to fit. And you just have all the pieces. But then when you look back, you say, oh, that's what that was for. That's what that was for. That was for. And it's those little steps in the journey along the way that just continue to show that God's present and He's engaged and He remembers me.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And they're not always bad things. Sometimes it comes out of really dark seasons that we feel God's presence, but sometimes it's also really good things that happen where we feel God's presence and His love. And as we continue in this series on the Psalms, we've been in there for a few weeks. I think what we're going to find today, as we take a psalm and split it in two, I think what we'll see is the psalmist is looking back and he's seeing where God has shown up and been faithful. He has this sense of the way that God has worked. And as a result of that, there's a confidence that he has in God's steadfast love.
Are you thinking that he's reflecting on personal experiences?
Yes and no. I think there's times when God has shown up personally, but the psalm describes more times that God has shown up nationally for Israel and helped the nation.
Isn't that kind of a characteristic? You've been walking us through these 5 different books of Psalms. Isn't that more of a characteristic of Book 3, Daniel?
Yeah, in fact, that's where we're going to be today. We're going to talk about Psalm 89. And what do we know about Book 3?
Yeah, we haven't been in Book 3 yet in our conversations, and it's a time when in Books 1 and 2, everything's been celebrating King David, and it's got celebration, but also lament laced through it. Mm-hmm. But then in Book 3, we start to see Israel declining more and more and more and more, right?
Yeah, the nation is falling apart, and Book 3 is full of these songs and prayers of looking to God in the midst of the nation falling apart. And asking why, especially when they feel like God has made so many promises to them as a nation. In fact, that's kind of where this psalm starts. Maybe we could begin there. Let's read the first 3 verses of Psalm 89. These are some big promises that Israel feels like God has made to them.
Psalm 89, a maskil of Ethan the Ezrahite. I will sing of your steadfast love, O Lord, forever. With my mouth I will proclaim your faithfulness to all generations.
For I have said, loving kindness will be built up forever. In the heavens you will establish your faithfulness.
And the Lord said, I have made a covenant with David, my chosen servant. I've sworn this oath to him. I will establish your descendants as kings forever. They will sit on your throne from now until eternity.
So God has made an oath. He's made a promise. He's made a covenant with David. I think those are some pretty big promises that Israel feels like they can lean on. But as we can see just from some of the Psalms around Psalm 89, things are falling apart. Psalm 86, the title of that psalm, the translators put in my translation, is Supplication for Help Against Enemies. Israel's surrounded by enemies. Psalm 88, prayer for help and despondency. And that particular lament, which that psalm is a psalm of lament, which means drawing attention to what's wrong with the world, and then normally asking God to do something about it. That's a lament like no other because it's almost entirely comprised of just drawing attention to what's wrong in the world. The author of Psalm 88 has lost all hope. I don't think Ethan has in Psalm 89. Because he remembers these moments when God was faithful.
So who is this guy, Ethan, Daniel? We haven't seen him, have we?
Nope, we haven't seen him in the Psalms yet, and we don't know very much about him. All we know is he gets mentioned in 1 Kings 4:31, and I would encourage our listeners to go look it up because I found it funny, because he's mentioned as a guy who's really, really wise, but not quite as wise as Solomon. So he's like second fiddle. And then this is a maskil of Ethan. That just means a contemplative poem. So it's this really wise dude, not quite as wise as Solomon, who's looking back and contemplating what God has done.
And in Ethan's defense, nobody was as wise as Solomon, so
Yep.
we can cut him a little slack for not being quite as wise.
We all relate, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Let's fast forward in the psalm a little bit. So we mentioned this covenant that God has made with Israel, with David specifically. And then if you just kind of glance through, you'll see all these examples of moments when Ethan remembers God's faithfulness to the people. But let's read verses 34 through 37 of Psalm 89. And these are some more of those promises that God has made. In fact, this is Ethan describing what he feels like God has said to Israel. So again, verses 34 through 37.
Can I start in verse 33? My translation starts speaking of God, saying, "But I will never stop loving him, nor fail to keep my promise to him. No, I will not break my covenant. I will not take back a single word I said."
And then in verse 35, once and for all, I've sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David.
His descendants shall endure forever, and his throne is the sun before me. It shall be established forever like the moon, and the witness in the sky is faithful.
Yeah, and then some of our translations have the word Selah there, which is this pause to think about this. So in the same way that Ethan has contemplated the faithfulness of God, take a moment to pause and think about the faithfulness of God and the way that God has shown up. One of the words that is repeated over and over in this psalm to this point, these first 37 verses of trust and confidence, is the word hesed, and we've talked about that word. It describes who God really is and how God acts in the world. And what are some of the descriptions of that word hesed? How is it sometimes translated?
Faithful love.
Faithfulness, faithful love.
Steadfast love. And, just a little aside, and I know this because my son is named Ethan. The name Ethan means steadfast heart. So here's a guy who has a steadfast heart, and as you said, Daniel is wise, not quite as wise as Solomon, but anyway, talking about God's steadfast love. That's meaningful.
That's good.
It's the way God acts, the way God is. He is love. This steadfast, loyal, faithful God who makes promises, and then Ethan says he keeps his promises until verse 38. So Mart, if you'll read verse 38 for us, this is Ethan now responding to all these promises that he feels like God has made to the people.
Okay, it looks like he's saying, but now you, God, have rejected him and cast him off. You are angry with your anointed king. You have renounced your covenant with him.
Yeah, verse 39, you have renounced your covenant. So what did we just see in the verses before this?
That he was steadfast in his love and his commitment and his promises. And then boom.
And that he would not break his covenant.
And then Ethan in this I think this amazing gift of honesty for us admits that he feels like God has broken his promises, that God hasn't kept his word.
It just feels like such a disconnect, Daniel. And I think we live in that disconnect so much of the time because the first 37 verses is God saying, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. And then from there on, it's Ethan saying, no, you're not.
Yeah.
And I think that there are times that we live in that space of finding it difficult to trust because what we are seeing and experiencing in life doesn't match up to what we feel like God has promised.
Yeah. And I just so appreciate what the Psalms give us permission to do. They give us permission to be honest with God when we're in those moments of moving from a tangible moment of feeling like God has been so real and faithful to those moments in the darkness of feeling like God has broken his promises. And that's where we'll pick up in this psalm tomorrow, in a moment when, yes, we can look back and see that God has been faithful in the past, but we really need him to show up and be faithful today too. So yesterday we read the first half of Psalm 89, and it sounded wonderful in many ways, didn't it? What did we read?
God's steadfast love, his faithfulness, endures forever. He's got us. Yeah.
And then it hit the wall.
Yeah.
Like I think we all agreed that we do. I think all of us felt great sympathy for Ethan, the Ezrahite, who was writing this psalm, because he was in that kind of in-between space when he recognizes what God's done in the past and is wondering if God's going to show up in the present.
So Daniel, is your sense that Ethan then constructed the psalm to emphasize that contrast, to bring in that element of surprise?
Yeah, and I think one of the indications that I see of that is the fact that so much of his focus is on what God said in the first half. And then as he turns to the second part of the psalm, he feels like God has rejected not just him, but also the nation. And so it has this turn in language from God saying, I have made this promise with David. I've made this covenant. I will never renounce. And then as we read at the end yesterday, verse 38, but you have spurned and rejected him. So Ethan looking back at God and saying, God, this is how I really feel.
You know what it kind of reminds me of is, because you were mentioning yesterday, Daniel, that in book 3 of the Psalms, where this one is, you have a nation in crisis and everything's fallen apart, and yet you get this great statement of God's faithfulness. And it put me in mind of Lamentations, where you have a similar situation, but in the middle of this great lament, you have that word, your mercies are new every morning, great is your faithfulness. And then he goes right back into lamenting again.
Absolutely.
That's good, Bill.
Yeah, Lamentations and the book of Psalms have so much in common because so much of the book of Psalms is also lament, which we've described as drawing attention to what's wrong in the world and asking God to do something about it. So in books 1 and 2, which are mostly Psalms of David, they're individual laments. So you see a lot of words like I or me or my. Nearly half of book 3 is full of laments, but many are communal laments. So the language changes to we or our or us, or refers to the land. this communal lament of not just feeling rejected as a person, which is kind of how we in the West tend to think of rejection. Ethan is describing God rejecting this kingdom, this nation, this people that God has made big promises to.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Daniel, because when we think about the state of our world, and when we think about the conditions that people are living in all over this world and are suffering and hurting, many of them are followers of Christ, and you say, that ought not be that way, and we cry out and lament for them. That brings me to a little bit better understanding of how this psalm works.
Let's read through these verses, and what I would encourage is just feel the emotion with Ethan as he describes how he feels in this. So starting in verse 38, and I'll begin. But now you, God, have spurned and rejected him. Again, remember, this is about the covenant that God made with David and with David's descendants. But now, God, you have spurned and rejected him. You are full of wrath against your anointed. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust.
You have broken through all his walls. You've laid his strongholds in ruins. All who pass by plunder him. He's become the scorn of his neighbors.
You have exalted the right hand of his adversaries. You have made all his enemies rejoice. You did also turn back the edge of the sword and have not made him stand in battle.
You have ended his splendor and overturned his throne. You have made him old before his time and publicly disgraced him.
How long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire? Remember how short my time is. For what vanity you have created all mortals. Who can live and never see death? Who can escape the power of Sheol?
Where are your former loving kindnesses, O Lord, which you did swear to David in your faithfulness? Remember, O Lord, the reproach of your servants. How do I bear in my heart the reproach of all the many peoples?
Your enemies have mocked me, O Lord. They mock your anointed king wherever he goes.
And it ends with the verse 52, blessed be the Lord forever.
Yeah.
Amen and amen. Wait a minute.
And it's this particular psalm that really draws attention to the editorial note that we've seen at the end of every single book of Psalms, because it really feels out of place in this one. Those words, blessed be the Lord forever, amen and amen, a version of those words shows up at the end of every book of the 5 books of Psalms.
And that's what this is.
And that's what
here.
this is here, because we're at the end of book 3. Now, as we've described book 3, we've been saying that it's this falling apart of the kingdom. We have like this description of the walls of Jerusalem being broken down, right? You've broken through all the walls. You have laid his strongholds to ruin. Now, it doesn't say Jerusalem there, but oftentimes when the psalmist is referring to the kingdom and it being destroyed, they're referring to Jerusalem, this symbolic center of Israel. It may not be referring to that, but I'm guessing that it is at this point, because he's obviously focusing a lot on David, on David's kingdom, on David's descendants, on the throne of David.
So David is long gone, but they're still hanging on to God's promises to him, right?
Yeah. And Ethan himself, we learn about who Ethan is from 1 Kings 4:31. And he's described as this really wise dude, but not quite as wise as Solomon. So already Solomon's kingdom has come and gone by the time we get to Ethan. And so he's looking back at David symbolically as the good old days, the time when everything seemed to be working the way that it was supposed to, this covenant of promises that God made to David. And so I think as I read this, that when he says David's crown has been defiled in the dust, when he's describing the walls being broken down, he's saying the whole nation is falling apart. All of God's promises seem like they're void at this point.
Yeah, and I think when we look at David's story and compare it to how Israel viewed David's story, they viewed it very idealistically. And when you read David's story, it's not all hearts and flowers. I mean, they're looking back and saying these were as you said, Daniel, these were the glory days. But when we look at it, we say, wait a minute, there are a lot of problems in there.
Yeah, in fact, the majority of the Psalms in Book 1, the majority of the Psalms in Book 2, the majority of the Psalms in Book 3 are lament, are drawing attention to what's wrong with the world and asking God to do something about it. So to your point, Bill, the good old days were not near as good as maybe we look back and think that they might have been. Are there any phrases in this psalm that jump out to you? Any that really capture just this despair that Ethan feels?
The one that hit me, Daniel, partly is because of our conversations with Randy Richards and the whole idea of the shame-honor culture in the Bible, because the last half of verse 45 for me says, "You have covered him with shame." And that just really jumped out at me because of how intensely that would have been felt in that shame-honor culture.
Yeah.
And it goes on in verse 50 and 51 similarly, how your servant was taunted, how I bear in my heart the insults of the peoples, how they taunted the footsteps of your anointed. You can really feel that.
Yeah, and the one that lingers with me now, it's become negative. When I look at it, all of a sudden in 52 it says, "Praise the Lord forever." I mean, okay, so an editor places that in. What does he expect us to think?
Yeah.
When we've been reading all of this sense of disillusionment, it just seems so out of place.
Yeah. I think it means something more. And I think what it is I think the editor wants to remind us that this isn't the end of the story. It doesn't end in despair.
That's good.
So we have this same note at the end of each book, and we're going to find out when we get to book 5, which we have to get through book 4, and book 4 is even more intense than book 3 in some ways. But we get to book 5, and book 5 is filled with phrases like, "Blessed be the Lord forever." And so I think it's this hint, this foreshadowing that in this moment of despair, don't get overwhelmed. Don't be so discouraged that you can't look forward or hold with hope to the promises of a good God who does what's right. I think, Mart, it's really good that you're feeling that tension, because all of us should feel that tension when we get to that. Here is this psalmist that's described all the pain that they're going through, and yet there's still this glimmer of hope. This isn't the end of the story. Something else is coming.
An encouraging reminder there in Psalm 89, the last psalm in Book 3, for anyone in a time of despair. It won't last forever. The story is not done yet, and something better is coming. Now, for Israel, it's actually going to get more difficult before it gets better, however. But God does keep his promises. He has in the past, and he will this time. But it often requires taking a long-range view to understand exactly how. Well, this is Discover the Word. You're at the table with Marty Hahn, Lisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, and Daniel Ryan Day for these conversations about how to read the Psalms. Now, as we study how to read the Psalms, and just having finished a focus on some of the Psalms in Book 3, I also want to tell you about some of our past episodes of Discover the Word that will help you dig into the Psalms even further. And one of our archived episodes is about Psalm 84, a psalm also in Book 3 that is called Nesting in God's Presence. Mart, Elisa, and Bill discovered how Psalm 84 can help us find peace and rest and be satisfied even when things seem to be falling apart. Psalm 84 provides a picture of how an ongoing relationship with God creates a home where we can both restore ourselves and minister to others. You'll find the Nesting in God's Presence episode in our archive by going to our discovertheword.org website and clicking the search button and then typing in simply Psalm 84. We also have a number of studies of Psalms in Book 4, where we're going next. And so to get an idea of how much work we've done in the Psalms, when you hit that search button, you can just type in Psalm as well, and you'll see a lot of options for doing more in-depth study in one of the Psalms through our discovertheword.org website. And so now, as we continue our discussion about how to read the Psalms, we're moving into Book 4, which begins with Psalm 90. And so in Book 4 of the Psalms, we find a people displaced, not able to live in their homes. They're in exile. Not an uncommon situation for groups of people throughout history, and even today, but always difficult.
What are some modern stories or examples of displaced people in the world?
I'm not sure that it would be considered a modern story, but it is a modern story to me. And that's just here in the United States and the American Indians and an entire ethnic group who was pushed off of their land, and their remnants are largely on reservations today and even still displaced from where they had lived for centuries.
Yeah. And the modern day version might be the refugees along the U.S.-Mexico border, and just the trouble and trials of their existence.
Yeah, and Elisa, that's a global
It is.
characteristic of our era, isn't it? You think of all the displaced people, all the movements of people who are fleeing either war or economic.
Sure. Syrian refugees, the Lost Boys in Somalia.
A couple of years ago, I was in Malaysia doing a Bible conference, and they took me to meet a group of people, and it was like these two huge extended families from a country that I will not name, but it's in the Middle East, and it's not at all sympathetic to the gospel. And they had given hundreds of thousands of dollars to some people to smuggle them out of the country and get them to safety in Australia. And they got them as far as Malaysia and dumped them there. And they couldn't go on because they didn't have proper documentation. They couldn't go back. And they were stuck in a place that was not supposed to be their destination.
Yeah, the other day I was spending some time with some people that work with refugees in West Michigan, and they're from nations that I didn't know there was refugees leaving those nations. This is such a universal problem in our world, and it always has been. But have you ever tried to kind of put yourself in their shoes and try to imagine some of the experiences that they go through as displaced people?
Well, when I met that group of folks that I was just speaking about, the largest emotions that they had were hopelessness and confusion.
And I would think aloneness. Often you don't speak the language where you are, and you're not always even with family. Sometimes you're with strangers yourself. I'm trying to think about just times when I've been in countries other than the United States, maybe in Africa or maybe in somewhere in Europe or down south. And there are times when I feel uniquely different. And there have been times I haven't been able to speak the language for sure. And there have been times when I have been a little bit stuck, at the wrong connection, not sure what to do with myself. Nobody necessarily appreciates my American passport. So that's very removed, but I'm trying to put my toe in the water on some of those experiences.
Yeah, most of my thoughts go back to the literature that I've read describing that period of slavery in the early years of our country, and sensing that mothers and fathers bore children that they could find themselves suddenly ripped apart as a family. And as far as the owner, who considered himself an owner of those children, it was like there was any lack of humanity. There was no sense of being able to feel empathy for the people whose families they were ripping apart. My feeling is I can hardly relate to that. It seems unthinkable that anybody would treat another human that way.
Yeah. I think these conversations are just so important, especially as we move into book 4 of the Psalms, because one of the themes in especially the Old Testament is this theme of exile, of being displaced, of being taken over by a dominant nation and taken to a place that's not your home. And we've been talking through the 5 books of Psalms, and we've talked about how books 1 and 2 describe, mostly they're Psalms of David that describe what we think are the good old days, but they're not as good because there's more lament than anything else in those 2 books. And then we get to Psalm 72, and it tells us that the Psalms of David have ended, although he does show up a few other times, but the majority of his prayers has ended. And then we talked about book 3 of Psalms last time. And what did book 3 kind of describe as we focused in on Psalm 89?
Is the nation going to pieces, falling apart almost in preparation for being exiled.
Yeah, and then we get to book 4, and there's this theme of exile within book 4 of Psalms, as these displaced people are trying to make sense of a God who made so many promises to them that specifically tied to the very land that they would live on. What were some of the promises that he made, and who were some of the people that God made those promises to in the Old Testament?
He mentions David, the promises made to David as king.
And you're talking about the release from Egypt and
Yep.
the wandering in the desert and God's provision. And I mean, this goes on for years and decades. And then finally the promise and then the experience of a new land with new leadership. So from Moses into Joshua.
And even before that, you could even include
Abraham,
Abraham
sure.
into that, because in a sense, he was in exile from his homeland and went to a place that he didn't know just because God said to go.
And so many of the promises of the Old Testament were about this piece of property, this home that Israel was promised. It was the promised land, right? That term, the promised land, that we use so much, but often forget to think about the fact that that first word is promise. And then they end up in exile. And so much of the Old Testament describes the falling apart of the kingdom and then them being taken out of their land. And so it makes sense that in this collection of prayers and songs, that there would be a section that's somewhat devoted to how do we make sense of a God who made so many big promises to us when we're in the middle of exile. So let's read just the first couple verses of Psalm 90. And we see right at the top, it's book 4. And let's read just verses 1 and 2.
Psalm 90, God's eternity and human frailty, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Lord, you've been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God.
So, Mart, you asked us a great question last week during our conversation, and that was, does it really matter who this particular psalm is devoted to? And I think we were talking about one of the psalms that was, whether it was of David or of Solomon. I think it really matters on this one, because we have a group of people that are in exile, and they need a new Moses. And so this prayer of Moses that we have at the beginning of book 4, which echoes a lot of the language of the prayer that Moses prayed after the golden calf incident. Let's just very quickly, what was the golden calf incident?
Well, Moses was up on the mountain, and he had been there for a long time, and the people thought maybe he was gone, period.
Yeah.
So they asked Aaron, Moses' brother, to create a golden calf. And it wasn't that they were saying, we're not worshiping God anymore, we're going to worship the golden calf. We're saying the golden calf is God. And this is the golden calf, the God who led us out. And they brought God's discipline upon them because of that.
And Moses prayed. He prayed to God and asked God to show mercy. And God also showed mercy. So he disciplined, but he also showed mercy. And this prayer that we have here at Psalm 90 echoes a prayer of Moses for God to show mercy. And so it makes sense, right, that of all people to show up in book 4, it's Moses. In fact, Moses doesn't show up in the rest of the Psalter, but he shows up in book 4 several times.
Why does that make sense, Daniel?
Because they need a new Moses to lead them out of exile, which they are right now, and back to their promised land.
It's a repetition of the freedom, the exodus out of exile again, is what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of a big theme throughout the whole Bible. Even when you get into the New Testament, Jesus becomes the ultimate Moses to lead us out of our exile and sin and brokenness. And so in all of these things, as you said in a previous program, Daniel, it keeps pointing us forward to a better story.
Yeah. And I love how this psalm starts, which we're running out of time, so that's the only place we'll be able to talk about today. Lord, you have been our dwelling place for all generations. Right now they're in exile. They're not in their normal dwelling place. But even in exile, even in a place that is not their home, they can still find their dwelling place. They can still find their home in God.
And so can we.
great reminder for anyone who's literally displaced right now, or maybe figuratively feels like they're in a place of exile. God is our dwelling place, and we can find our home in Him. Psalm 90, a psalm written by Moses that begins Book 4 of the Psalms, because at that point in their history, as Daniel said, the overall sentiment of that time was that we are in captivity, we're in exile, and we need a new Moses. Well, next, Daniel wants to take us to a psalm in Book 4 that doesn't at first seem to fit for a number of reasons. He's going to point us at Psalm 103 and, in a sense, ask the group to address two important questions that we probably should ask whenever we read a psalm. The two questions are, 1, who wrote it? And 2, in which of the 5 books of Psalms does it appear? The answers to those two questions will frame our understanding of what we read. And so let's continue this conversation about how to read the Psalms.
All right, Elisa, you were saying something off air that I think is really helpful because one of the things that I hope our listeners know very well by now is the fact that often a lot of these conversations come because we have our own discoveries in the scriptures.
Absolutely.
We're learning as we go. And so will you just describe kind of how some of this Psalms stuff is clicking for you?
I've just had kind of a pop of insight as we've been unpacking this over these last several weeks together. And you've helped so much, Daniel, talking about the 5 books of the Psalms that I'm starting to understand, because you'll see these Psalms that are attributed to David, and then a Psalm attributed to Ethan, and then a Psalm attributed to Moses. And you're like, what? And what I'm starting to understand is that the Psalms are a little bit like poetry anthology. You know, if you had a collected volumes of poems, American poems or something, or poems from the world kind of thing, and you might have
different authors, right?
Different authors. You might have something from William Blake. You might have something from Maya Angelou. You might have something from Emily Dickinson or Robert Frost, or something from E.E. Cummings. And they're completely different authors, but they come together. And maybe the Psalms is a bit like a patchwork of telling the story of God's work in our world and His love for humankind through different pieces put in different places to tell the story.
And maybe the difference between what you're describing, Elisa, and what Daniel's leading us through in the Psalms is that in the Psalms, we have the poems not only selected, but arranged to move us to some place in God's story.
And many anthologies do run according to a theme.
That's right.
Or a purpose, a subject.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're seeing here in the book of Psalms. So there's 5 books of Psalms, which parallel the 5 books of Moses, right, which is what the Old Testament is built upon. And so we have these 5 books of Psalms. And what are some of the themes that we've seen in the first 3 books of Psalms? Now we're in book 4, but what are the themes of these books?
Well, the first book is the glory days of Israel under the reign of David, King David, when supposedly everything was great, which of course it wasn't, but that's what was held up as the standard.
And the second book was the Glory Days Part 2, because it continued that theme. And what's interesting is that even though it's supposed to be celebrating the Glory Days, you've been reminding us that books 1 and 2 are both filled with the lament psalms.
Okay, so as we say that, it almost sounds like we're indicating that there's a little bit of insincerity in this anthology. If it's set up to remember the glory days, but in reality, they weren't all that great.
I think it's actually the opposite, Mart. I think that the anthologist is being so sincere that he wants the reader to realize that there's brokenness and pain even in the best of times. And so King David, yes, so much was going well for King David and for Israel at that time, but so much was still broken and falling apart for King David and for Israel.
Okay, and you're saying as far as the Psalms are concerned in these collections, that honesty is on the face of it, right?
Yeah.
It is being held out.
Yep. And being honest specifically with God, being able to pour our hearts out to God in moments of good and especially in moments of bad.
And then we were looking briefly at book 3, which takes us into a season of time where the songs are describing a people who, as the nation of Israel is falling apart before going into exile, right?
Yeah. And then book 4 is this reflection of a people in exile that are trying to make sense of these big promises that they feel like God had made to them. He had given them this special law, this law of Moses that they valued so much as this unique way of walking with God. And then they also felt that he had given them this promise of King David, of this throne that would last forever, that they could look to and find comfort in and strength in. And then he gave them King David, whom they looked back at as this worship leader of Israel. And so in book 4, they're trying to make sense of all these big promises of God that they felt like God had given them. And yet here they are in exile, away from the place God promised, away from the temple of worship that was built and then destroyed, and they have no king. And so how do we make sense of what we thought our faith was, right? This is Israel's perspective. How do we make sense of what we thought our faith was about when all of the primary things that we thought our faith was about have gone away?
And that's really a scenario that I can imagine just about anybody can identify with.
Yeah.
Anybody of faith, anybody who has tried to believe.
Yeah. And that's where these Psalms could be so helpful to us, because they invite us to be honest with God in that very real way as well. So we're in book 4. We've already said that David's Psalms are in book 1 and 2, but we're in Psalm 103, and who is this a psalm of or attributed to?
Here comes David.
Here comes David. And what is the title of this psalm?
Thanksgiving for God's goodness.
Mine says praise for the Lord's mercies.
Praise for the Lord's mercies. So why, in a book that is supposed to be in exile reflecting on the promises of God, why might there be a psalm of thanksgiving and praise for God's goodness?
I picture the command on the airplanes when the oxygen drops. You put it on yourself before affixing it to someone else. It's a season of deep need for fresh air, for hope, to remember. And it's almost like that's what the anthologist of the Psalms here is doing, is providing that here.
Yeah, I think so. And let's read a few verses that I think really capture that. Let's read verses 2 through 5.
Well, don't forget verse 1, because I can't let you skip verse 1, because every time I see verse 1, I think of Andre Crouch, and I hear him singing it.
Well, then, Bill, you start it off, and let's start with verse 1. That sounds great.
Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name.
Bless the Lord, O my soul, and do not forget all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquity, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good as long as you live, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles.
The first thing that really struck me as I was reading through this psalm is all the actions of God that are described in these verses. God is a God who forgives in verse 3, who heals in verse 3, who redeems in verse 4, who crowns in verse 4, who satisfies in verse 5. And if you look through the psalm, it continues, verse 6, the Lord works vindication. So God is at work, even in exile, is what this psalmist is trying to hold on to, that God is at work.
So again, are we saying that what these people in trouble are doing is trying to reach back to the faith of a person that they thought could give them hope? Is that what was happening here?
Yeah, I think so. I think in the same way that when we're in dark places, we often look back and remember where God has been faithful.
And in verse 4, the word that we've seen so many times, the word hesed, shows up again, which continues to drive forward. Even in exile, God's hesed, his loving kindness, his faithful love, is still real.
Yeah, and this psalm also includes in verse 8 this answer to the question, who is our God? And this shows up throughout the whole Old Testament. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. Those verses show up in Numbers, in Jonah, throughout the Psalms quite a few times. This statement of who is our God? Our God is the merciful God. He's gracious. He's slow to anger. He's abounding in steadfast love.
For people in exile, the first time those words appear, Daniel, are God's description of himself to Moses in Exodus 34, as they have just come out of a kind of exile and slavery in Egypt. So that reminder, the God who brought us out of Egypt before is still able to bring us out of exile here.
Yeah, that's good. I wonder, too, if David is so important to them. because he was fallible because of his errors, his problems, and his own weaknesses. And to be able to hear David saying, he forgives all of my sins.
Yeah.
I wonder if that wasn't a source of hope and encouragement.
That's good.
In the same way that we read David's words now and go, oh, he forgives all my sins, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what they're doing here. They're looking back, and they need some David theology. They need the reminders of David's worship. And we have this hint that they're still in this place of suffering. They're still experiencing discipline. Verse 9, it says, he will not always accuse, nor will he keep his anger forever. This psalm is still rooted in the reality of what they're experiencing today.
Yeah.
This isn't just pie in the sky, hoping that everything, hey, it's all going to work out, yay. Yes, things will work out, but because our God is a God who is merciful and gracious, because our God is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and because they could hold on to that, even in the midst of exile, they could still, through David's words, yes, bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all of his benefits.
Yeah, great encouragement. In that psalm, Psalm 103, encouragement that gives us a way to respond to those really difficult times that we go through in life. That psalm is in Book 4, and in the next segment, we'll also be in Book 4 again, looking at the last psalm of that book. What kind of psalm is it? I think you'll say, oh, that makes sense, when you find out in just a moment. And as we continue to study how to read the Psalms in this episode, let me take just a moment to tell you about some of our past episodes of Discover the Word that will help you dig into the Psalms even further, and especially the Psalms in Book 4 that correspond with this period of exile out of the land in Israel's history. We have an archived episode about Psalm 100 called Call to Worship. Psalm 100 is just 5 verses long, but it encourages us to express a heart of worship to God. Mart, Elisa, and Bill discussed in this episode how praising God can change your life. They talk about the purpose of worship, worshiping with gratitude, and more. Hope you'll check out this episode about worship and Psalm 100 and discover why God is so deserving of our whole heart and our best praise. And I think knowing that it is in Book 4 will make it even more meaningful for you. You'll find it at discovertheword.org. Click the search button and type in Psalm 100. And you'll also find a lot more Psalm studies when you type just Psalm into the search. A lot of options will come up at discovertheword.org. And so now, let's go to Psalm 106, that last psalm in Book 4, the part of the collection that corresponds with Israel's years in exile, and see why it makes so much sense that Psalm 106 would be a confession psalm.
If I say the word confession, what comes to mind?
To admit.
Okay.
And I go to the crime show where the accused falls apart and sobs saying, I did it, and confesses.
My mind immediately goes to when I make a mess of something at home and I have to go and confess it to my wife and ask her to forgive me for making a mess of whatever it was this time.
So it's interesting, all 3 examples so far are about guilt, but there are confessions that are about like a statement of faith, right? Like the Westminster Confession or others.
Yeah.
And it can be done individually or collectively, right?
Mm-hmm. When we talk about it like in a church setting, Mart, which I think is kind of what you're describing to an extent, right? You have individual confession, which might be someone confessing sin that has creeped up in their life, or there might be a moment in a service where everyone is saying the same words together.
Yeah.
I think for many of us, we're really uncomfortable with the communal kind of confession because we do live in the West where we tend to be very individualistic. So we think of confession as kind of a private thing, where maybe in other cultures, the community confession, the communal confession feels more natural to them. Is that just me, or do you feel that too?
I think as a rule it is, but I think some of the most powerful confessions that I've ever participated in were in a church setting where the pastoral staff, I think, had written up a confession that really had to do with our way of life, our materialism. And I'll tell you, I found myself honestly admitting to wrongs that I never would have personally confessed. And I felt like as a group of worshipers, we were doing that honestly.
So would you say, Mart, that within that confession there was a personal identification with things in your life that maybe didn't line up with the best that God would lead us to?
Without a doubt.
But then also within that was this communal, this we understanding that you weren't alone in that confession, that others had also participated in being not on God's path.
And by admitting it individually together, it really gave us a bigger picture, I think, of what we're dealing with.
I've been a part of a board or a ministry organization when we collectively have come to understand that we made wrong decisions or mishandled leadership, or maybe perhaps needed to have taken action to remove leaders and had waited and more disasters had happened, or those kinds of examples. And I resonate with what you're saying, Mart. It's been a time of both personal and collective. It's like I confess and then we confess, and neither one really gets us off the hook. It's the both and kind of a thing, the posture before God.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the psalm that we're in today, we're going to see a communal confession in which I think the psalmist, we can see him identifying with the brokenness that's around him. But it's written in the language of the we, that we have all played some part in this brokenness. We've been talking through the books of Psalms. Psalms is broken apart into 5 books. And what is kind of the overarching narrative of Book 4 of Psalms?
Book 4 expresses the struggle of Israel being in exile, the yearning and the disastrousness and the pain of it, of being exiled.
Yeah, which really makes a lot of sense, because after seeing Book 3, where we saw the nation kind of coming apart at the seams, now the end result of that is they're in exile and they're calling out to the God that they had kind of ignored.
So they could honestly say, we didn't just get here by accident.
Right.
We were part of the path that brought us here. Yeah.
And just to kind of show this theme of exile that's in Book 4, this psalm that we're in today, 106, ends with this plea, this request from God. Bill, would you read Psalm 106, verse 47 for us?
Sure. It says, "Save us, O Lord our God, and gather us from among the nations to give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise."
So we have right here within this psalm this plea for God to rescue them, to gather them from the nations, this language of exile. But as you said, Mart, there's some responsibility that the people of Israel are taking, even though they may not have been those who made some of the mistakes that got them to exile. They're taking some of the responsibility of knowing that, yes, but we're the same kind of people who would have gotten ourselves in this place too.
I think in an individualistic culture, we don't tend to identify the sins of our forefathers as our sins. We think of our sins as our sins, my sins as my sins. We don't think that what my ancestors did, I have to own a part of that. But that's what you're saying that they're doing here, right?
Yeah, that's what we see. And we'll see it in verse 6 specifically. Elisa, if you'll read Psalm 106, verse 6, and remember, this is within the context of a confession of the sins of ancestors.
Both we and our ancestors have sinned. We've committed iniquity. We've done wickedly. Our ancestors, when they were in Egypt, did not consider your wonderful works. They did not remember the abundance of your steadfast love, but rebelled against the Most High at the Red Sea. And he goes on.
Yeah, verse 13, they forgot his works and did not wait for his counsel. We have numerous examples in the Old Testament of them trying to do things on their own and ending up in a place of destruction. Verse 16 refers to one of the rebellions, the mutinies against Moses in the camp, and of Aaron, the Holy One of the Lord. Verse 19 talks about making a calf that they worshipped, an idol that they were worshiping instead of worshiping God, despising the promised land that God gave them in verse 24. The psalmist goes through this history of all these places in which the brokenness of Israel becomes very clear. But it still is anchored by verse 6, where he is saying, it's not just their problem. This is something that I struggle with too.
And you know what? They can see their sin, that they have sinned like their forefathers had sinned. It's very different from, say, Job, his story, where he ended up in a terrible situation with all kinds of suffering. But he couldn't put his finger on a sin that caused him to be there. So it's important here that in this situation, their exile, they can see and agree it's the result of decisions we have made along the way, of our own failures and faults.
And in Middle Eastern communities, there's this generational concept of, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the history that ties us all together, and that we were in Abraham when he did this and this and this. And you get all these generational ideas. So there's a much stronger connection between the person writing Psalm 106, maybe during the exile, and Abraham than we would say with us and Martin Luther or somebody.
Yeah.
You'll also notice there's this progression of evil getting worse and worse as we go through the psalm, to the extent that by the time we get to verses 37 and 38, the psalmist is looking at Israel's history and recognizing those moments when the worship of false gods got so bad that they were killing their very children in worship. They were sacrificing the innocent blood of their children to worship these foreign gods. What's interesting to me, even this conversation, right, is we're at the end of book 4. Book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4 are full of laments, of drawing attention to what's wrong in the world and asking God to do something about it. We get to the end of exile, and they're drawing attention to the wrong that they've done in the world and asking God to do something about it.
Yeah, it's almost like they're not drawing attention to what's wrong with the world. They're drawing attention to what's wrong with us.
Yeah.
In a way that's a bit refreshing. We're always saying, I can't change the world. What can I do to make a difference? I'm only one person. We all feel that in the West, especially. But the reality is that my posture, and as I share it with our posture in the group of believers that I worship with and that I serve with, and even in my friends and my family, my posture and our posture really matter.
Yeah. And so when we get to those points where we realize there's something in my life that is just so broken, we can say with the psalmist in verse 47, "Save us, O Lord our God." And when we get to those points in our culture where we see this deep brokenness that affects all of us, we can, as a culture, communally say, God, we are broken. Save us. So there is this individual aspect of responsibility. There's this communal aspect of responsibility. But either way, there's only one place to look at those moments, and that's to the God that saves us and gathers us. And that's what Book 5 of Psalms is going to be all about.
Yeah, and the way that Psalm 106, ends with the confession and request for God to save is how Book 4 of the Psalms ends. The book that corresponds with Israel being in exile ends that way. And so now make sure you're back here at the table with us for the last episode in this series about how to read the Psalms. I think you'll have an aha moment in our next conversation as we see how Psalm 107, the first psalm in Book 5, begins. You're at the table with Marty Hahn, Elisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, and Daniel Ryan Day as we finish up part 4 of our series called How to Read the Psalms. Another great hour of studying with the group, and you've made it this far, so I hope you'll make sure to be part of part 5 to finish this off. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. And that last part, that'll really come through clearly in part 5 of our How to Read the Psalms study. And as I said, Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, and we are committed to fueling a Bible engagement movement around the world. And I want to say thanks for remembering that Discover the Word is made possible because listeners like you give to support this ministry. When you give to Discover the Word, you're partnering with us and with all of Our Daily Bread Ministries in getting the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible out to people all over the world. You can give a one-time gift, or you can become a monthly Discover the Word partner. As a global, nonprofit, donor-supported organization, your support does make a difference. And so simply go online to discovertheword.org, click Donate, and explore your options. Well, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Henninga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries.